I always have to think of
Ah,
always
yeah,
a
you think we ought to wait a
different-
minute?
you
Well,
have a different argument, and you
Yeah,
can bottle
yeah.
it a little differently.
Yeah. For me, I sort of tend to anchor it to whatever I'm
Yeah.
recently in research.
We're going to have you speak first. I hope that's okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
No, I understand that, and that.
Yeah, that helps a little bit. At least that you have something to practice. Something like that. It's just a hard idea.
Well, mine's worse than that. I really make the same policy argument, but for some reason I think it through.
It needs to be made. It needs to be made.
Otherwise,
So,
it's not interesting.
Absolutely.
or is it just the one? If somebody's going to use PowerPoint,
Yeah, I'm getting.
are you using?
Giovanni is.
Yeah.
Hi, Giovanni Peri. Nice to meet you.
Welcome to the center.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Good morning. There may be a few people still trying to get into the building. I apologize. This building is a public-private institution, and some of the people in the U.S. government insist on very strict rules on getting into the building. Sometimes takes a little time, particularly if you haven't been here before. I'm Mike Van Dusen, Executive Vice President of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and I want to welcome you to this living memorial to our 28th president. And this is the 5th year of a marvelous collaboration between the Center and the Merage Foundation. This seminar today will lead towards a dinner tonight, which will honor the tremendous example of some leading immigrants to this country that have done so well and such a marvelous example, as well as honoring the young scholars that have been going to college and graduate school with Merage scholarships. And they are, each of them, inspiring young individuals and, of course, leaders for tomorrow for the United States. This is a seminar today, and what has been a down economy is extraordinarily important. The issue of immigration, jobs, and the economy. And I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank Dr. Philippa Strum for helping to moderate, and I want to thank Marshall Kaplan and Paul Merage for this wonderful collaboration we've had. And again, the Merage Foundation is to be commended for its leadership in a key area, helping immigrants and looking to the future of the United States. So thank you very much, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Marshall Kaplan, who's going to say a few words, and I hope you have a wonderful seminar, and we appreciate all of you coming. Come back to the center. Thank you.
Well, I just came off the farm where I had a few illegal immigrants working for me. And then I'm now going to a restaurant where I'll have other immigrants working for me. So I feel compelled to come here today and talk about solutions which will allow more immigrants to work for me. And thankfully we have two scholars here who will probably help me sort it through. But I do want to make some comments. In the 80s, we did a bit of a study when I was dean at the University of Colorado School of Public Affairs about how policymakers make decisions, how legislatures look at problems. And we did some focus groups. And it was interesting. Legislators don't use data. I'm sorry, Giovanni. They don't use analysis. Sorry, Tamar and Giovanni. What they do is they speak to their friends, generally, and they govern by anecdote and story. And they pick up bits and pieces, but then those bits and pieces become advocacy. So the people who want to, in the immigration case, stop immigration will pick up the language you might have in there out of context and say, Peri and Borja, your colleague at Harvard, Peri and Borja say there is an impact, and it could be significant, even though it's relatively small. And in your case, it's relatively positive. And so we really, and you look at other key issues facing America, climate change. Data analysis is not really the substance from which policy is made. And so something is wrong there with the connection and the system. And perhaps our effort today ought to be to go through that data and analysis on immigration and jobs, and in effect see if we can sort it out and break down some of the mythologies and create truisms or facts on the ground. And we'll essentially be talking about three issues. And they're framed by Dr. Peri in his wonderful paper. Do immigrants take our jobs, or do they help the general economy or the economy? And that's generally, he says, at the lower end, that question is very relevant in terms of less skilled workers. And at the upper end, he says, do immigrants crowd out American highly skilled workers, technologists, scientists? And in the middle, the broad band of Americans, immigrants, he makes the point, complement America's skill level, low skills, high level skills. And Tamar, in articles she has written, has talked about the bifurcation of immigrant impact. At the lower end, low skilled workers, somewhat counterintuitively, Tamar calls attention to the fact that they make major contributions to the American economy. And at the upper end, they make major contributions to the American economy and have quite an impact on GNP at both ends. So but there are others who dispute Peri and Jacoby. And Jacoby moves over from the numbers and analysis to talk about policy options and where we might go as a country, assuming we can give a rationality pill to our congressmen and women, and that we can really begin to look at the issues facing immigrants, but also facing our country. So I'm going to turn it over to the moderator, Philippa, right? And you will introduce our panelists, and we'll move on from there. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to see you all here, and a special welcome to the Merage Scholars. We're really delighted to have you at the center. Mike Van Dusen said a couple of words about the center, but I know that most of you haven't been here before, so I thought I would tell you that while members of the Congress may not look at data, occasionally they do something right. And one of the things that they did right was to create the Wilson Center. They decided that instead of putting up another marble monument, as you know, Washington is quite famous for its marble monuments, or cluttering up the mall, they would do something else. They would put together an institution that pulled the two parts of Woodrow Wilson's life together. Some of you may know that before Woodrow Wilson became a politician, he was a major political scientist, wrote books that are still used by political scientists today, and was also the president of Princeton University. Then he decided to run for governor of New Jersey, and then very quickly became president of the United States. So there are two strands to his career. One is the scholarly strand, and the other is the public policy making strand. And Congress decided to pull those together by creating the Wilson Center that would bring policymakers and scholars together to talk about issues that are important to both of those groups. And of course, no issue is more important to our country today than the issue of immigration. So we feel that we are doing exactly what Congress meant us to do, and something that we hope will help illuminate this very important discussion. I should tell you that today's event is being webcast, which means that there are people watching it at home right now, and it will be archived on our website, so there will be people watching it in the future. And for the benefit of them, I'm going to say just a few words about each of our speakers. Those of you who are in the room got biographies handed out, but for those at home, let me introduce Giovanni, Peri, and Tamar Jacoby. Professor Peri is an associate professor of economics at the University of California, Davis. He's also a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he has taught at Bocconi University in Milano, at the European University Institute, Florence, and at UCLA. He has done research on human capital, growth, and technological innovation. And most recently, he has focused and published extensively in international journals on the impact of international migrations on labor markets and on productivity. He recently received a MacArthur Foundation grant for the study of international migration and its impact in the United States, as well as a World Bank grant for the study of return migration in Europe. So we are delighted to have Professor Peri with us this morning. Tamar Jacoby, and we're delighted to have her return to the center, she's been on a number of programs here, is President and Chief Executive Officer of Immigration Works USA, which is a national federation of small business owners working to advance immigration reform. She was formerly a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where she wrote and commented extensively on immigration and citizenship. Before that, she was a senior writer and justice editor for Newsweek and the deputy editor of the New York Times op-ed page. She has written numerous articles which have appeared in major publications across the United States, newspapers and magazines, and has published her first book called Someone Else's House, America's Unfinished Struggle for Integration, and more recently, Reinventing the Melting Pot, the New Immigrants and What It Means to Be American. So as you can see, we have two extremely well-versed scholars in the subject that we're going to be talking about today. Just a note, if any of you have your cell phones on, will you please double-check just to make sure that they're off so we don't interrupt either of our speakers. And with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to Professor Peri. Please, if you want to sit here, if you want to go up there.
I think I'm going to go.
Fine,
up
whatever
there,
is
and
comfortable
on the
for
way,
you.
I'm also going to check my cell phone because it would be too bad if my cell phone rings. Yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to the Merage Foundation. Thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Center for having me here. This is a really interesting, very nice event. I love the idea that I can talk in front of such a remarkably distinguished audience. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to give an overview. This PowerPoint presentation is going to be available at the website of this event. And the plan for today, I'm going to try to spend these 20 minutes first giving you a few data, a little numbers to frame this issue of immigration. And then, as Marshall was saying, I'm going to address two specific issues. One is what are the labor market effects of immigrants, and in particular, how do they affect the employment and wages of native workers. There is an academic debate on this that I will touch upon, so we academics ourselves do not agree 100%. However, I think there has been some quite interesting recent research on this that has moved on this debate in trying to understand the mechanism through which immigrants affect wages and employment, just then estimating their impact, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to talk about this will be, when I say, so this group will be low education, in general workers who have high school or less. And then I'm going to move to talk about the effect of immigrant with a high level of education. And I'm going to show that there are many of them coming to this country, and the question is how many are they? Do they help our innovation ability, the productivity of this country? And then I will draw a few conclusions. So some numbers here. So the immigration in terms of number has been growing a lot in the United States in the last few years. This is the number of immigrants. On the left scale are millions. This is the number of immigrants in the United States from 1850 to 2008. As you see, in terms of number of immigrants, we are experiencing a very large and unprecedented number. However, if you look at a more appropriate statistic, which is the percentage of immigrants in the population, and you read this on the right scale, the percentage of immigrants of the population was actually higher than it is right now towards the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. Then very draconian immigration laws essentially closed the flow of immigrants so that the share of foreign-born went down, and the trough of this, the lowest point, is in 1970, and since 1970, with the introduction of, in 1965, on new laws, this started. So in historical perspective, we are in a period of high immigration, but by no means of unusually high immigration as a percentage of the population. I would say, however, that what has worried maybe a lot of the commentator and the academic, besides the absolute number of immigrants, is a little bit the composition of immigrants. Here, starting from 1960 and to 2000, I don't have the 2008 here, it would be just a little higher than 2000. Starting from 1960, I'm showing the percentage of immigrants among workers with low education, the blue line, the blue bar, worker with high school or less, and among workers with some college or more education. So it has always been true that there have been a little bit more immigrants at the low level of education, but this disparity has grown a little bit, or has grown in the last period, so that in 2000, 16% of the employment, this is as a percentage of employment in the US of less educated, so high school or less, is 16% foreign-born, and only 10.7 is of the highly educated is foreign-born. However, I would like to look a little bit more closely at the skill composition of immigrants. We can learn something interesting just looking at this. And let me anticipate this before I'm going to go to the next slide and show it. What is really happening is not that there has been an increase in the less skilled and a decrease in the inflow of high skill. What has happened is that the skill of the immigrant has increased its polarization. There are more immigrants at the low or very low level of education, and more immigrants at the high or extremely high level of education, and there are fewer in the middle. Let me show the picture. So this is the picture of the composition. This is a picture that shows what is the percentage of immigrants in each of this group of schooling. Let me go from left to right. High school dropout, people with a high school degree, people with a college degree, master and PhD in science, managerial profession and engineering. And the last group, which is a very small numerically but very interesting, are Nobel laureates in natural science, physics, chemistry, and medicine. Dr. Zewail is one of these. What is this? This is the percentage of the group that is foreign-born. So as you see, interestingly, while the average number of foreign-born is about 13% in the whole population, these are data for 2005, but they are roughly similar now, the group of immigrants with high school and some college is relatively small vis-a-vis the group of immigrants with no education or with high and very high education. And notice that this group is very small numerically, but arguably, and I'm going to show something, this is going to be a very useful group for scientific and technological innovation and therefore for productivity growth. So the interesting of this is that 70% of the American employment is in these two groups, high school graduate and college graduate. These are the group which in relative terms are feeling the least the competition, and they're feeling the most what we economists call the complementarity. And I'm going to talk about this. If you have a firm, you do need some janitors, you do need some sales representative, and you do need some engineer. If you have more available janitors at a price which is not too high, you can expand your firm, generate more jobs, and this will create jobs for this intermediate group, which is typically staffed by US born. So this last sentence that I put is interesting because it's a little bit counter what a lot of people say. Really, if you want, from an economic point of view, to maximize the productivity, the productive effect of immigrants, you will want them to be as different as possible in skill from the skill of Americans. Because if they come with different skills, they are going to provide services, take occupation and jobs, which Americans tend relatively not to, and they will complement and they will generate demand for American worker in other type of skills. Now, let me say a couple of words about the academic debate on the effect of immigration on wages and employment. So I would say that the effect of immigrants on the labor market is a little controversial. In particular, I would put there are two schools of thought. One that says, which is led by George Borjas of Harvard, that says that overall there is some negative impact of immigrant at the low end of the educational spectrum. So people who have no high school degree probably suffer, the more recent estimate that he has is that they suffer the loss of 3% of their wage over 20 years. So this is nothing like the apocalyptic scenario that sometimes, Ludovs presents, but it's still a little loss over this period. And also this group says that it is not really, we cannot really infer too much by looking at the city evidence or state evidence. We have to take the U.S. as a whole, because in a city, the impact of immigrant is going to be diluted by the fact that natives leave the city and they may transfer this effect elsewhere. Another group, though, and this group has David Card of Berkeley as one of the important exponents, says that really looking carefully across the cities and across the state, we don't really see much wage and employment effect, not even at the level of less educated. Maybe there is a 0 to 1 -% effect on less educated, but it's hard to find and it's hard to tell that it's different from 0. And even accounting for the fact that native workers are mobile, still you don't observe very much employment loss at all. In fact, the employment effect is almost never found in these studies. Now, with this debate, I think that the new question that has come, given that there has been, I think in the recent period, there has been a few papers that have come down a little bit on this side, then the question is that how is it possible that the U.S. receives so many so relatively large number of workers who have low level of education, and the impact at the very most is a -3%, which is over 20 years. So this is 0.15% per year, very small, or in most likely is 0 or positive. So I think the recent job have started to think about how the inflow of immigrants generates a response of native worker. The American economy is a dynamic economy in flow. It's not a static thing. And so people have started studying and looking and thinking a little bit more about this complementarity effect at work that I will talk about in a second. And they have started reconciling the results, saying that in the end, the national and the local approach do, if we account for this complementarity effect, do bring the same type of response. So in word, the idea is this. So at the low level of education, immigrant, so it's based on a comparative advantage theory. Comparative advantage is at the very core of economics. David Ricardo is the first who said that if some people or some countries, in the case of trade, do relatively better some job and others do relatively better other jobs, and there is a specialization, both profit from this. So if you think a second, and here I'm talking about workers with low level of education, high school or less. Immigrants, in terms of worker of less education, are usually specialized in jobs which have a large manual physical components. And this is probably because they have a comparative disadvantage in speaking English, which is not their native language. So again, I'm going to show some data, but if you look at a sector like construction, construction worker, drywall installer, it's a type of occupation where there are a lot of immigrant. Taxi driver in another. A taxi driver need coordination of hands, a good knowledge of where you're going, but it doesn't require communication. As a consequence, this inflow of native into this occupation has pushed the really native at the same level of education to do type of job which have a larger communication interaction content, where they have a comparative advantage. So if you are an American worker and you used to be a construction worker with some experience and more construction worker coming in, you become a supervisor. You become a intermediate between sort of the engineer and the worker, because you can communicate with both and you can take advantage of your communication. If you are used to be a taxi driver, you get bumped up a little bit and become a dispatcher, the guy who takes the call and tells to the driver where to go. So if this manual type of job and this communication type of job, we need both of them if they are complementary in this sense, an increase in the supply of this type of job increases the demand for this type of job. And this is the idea through which, if native have been moving from this type of occupation to this type of occupation, the inflow of immigrant is actually increasing the demand for them and does not need to hurt the employment and the wage of them. Couple of data. I'm saying these things. It would be fun to keep you for longer than 20 minutes and tell you how economists measure the content of this. But there are some very detailed data on what kind of skills you need to do different jobs. And this data essentially shows that if we construct an index of how communication intensive relative to manual are jobs that native workers do at low level of education, this is only for high school, and how communication versus manual are the job that new immigrants do, you see two things here. First, that native always did significant, and these are old immigrants who have been 10 years or more in the country, these are new immigrants. So native have always done jobs which are more manual intensive than than immigrant. But over time, while native have stayed at the same level of intensity, or even increased, immigrants have specialized into a manual job and away from communication job. And it's even more stunning if you look across countries, across states in the United States. This is the share of immigrants in the United States, and this is how intensive is the communication content of jobs done by native in the US. So you see California up here, which is the state that had more immigrant. California has a lot of immigrant, and in California, native low-educated workers do a lot of communication type of jobs. So in California, the landscaper, the nannies are in large part immigrant, and the native workers have moved, even at relatively low level of education, to be to do some more clerical type of work, to do some more work like supervision, to do so in the company that comes and landscape my backyard. The workers are typically immigrant, but the guy who drives the van and the person who's taking the order, an entrepreneur in an entrepreneurial role, is California. Interesting, not only the specialization of native has moved towards more communication type of tasks when immigrants are there, but also the compensation of communication tasks has gone up. So if you have more people who do manual job, you increase the demand for communication type of job. And again, if you look at states that had a lot of immigrants, in those states, even for low level of education, communication intensive type of jobs, again, like jobs in a little supervisory role, interactive role, are paid more. So that transition of native in response of inflow of immigrant, and in response of the fact that the whole labor market in the US is changing, has shielded the native from the negative effect and has generated potentially some dynamic gain. So the idea is to consider the US economy as a dynamic place. It's not a place that stays, and if one job is taken by one, it's not taken by the other. Because one job taken by a person allows a firm to increase and allows new job to be created. And if you account for this dynamic gain, in the long run, there seems to be a net creation of jobs, especially in communication-intensive type of occupation, which are typically the one taken by native workers. And this process of moving of native towards this type of occupation, and even in the same occupation, you can think of a specialization of native in more communication and immigrant in more manual, reduces the competition of immigrant really and increases their complementarity. So if we had fewer immigrants, we would have had fewer native pushed up into this other type of job and less of this type of dynamic gain from specialization, from enlargement. Of course, a lot of this dynamic gain imply that companies expand, invest, and therefore maybe choose the right technological mix for that type of worker. And so it may take some time. I recently have spent a lot of time to try to understand how long does it take for this effect to fully work out. And I think within 7 years, we already see most of these positive effects. So if you look at the more recent formal studies of the labor market that account for this mechanism, we do not really seem to find this long-run negative impact of immigrants, even at the low end of the spectrum, on employment or wages, or if we find it's very little, as it's not very different from zero, while we still find a positive effect at the high end of the spectrum, that I will talk about in a second. And therefore, the reason why this impact is not so large is because, if you want to say it simply, immigrants take different jobs from native, and they push native to occupation in which they have a comparative advantage that actually increase the productivity of the economy. So let me spend whatever time I have left talking about highly educated immigrants now. So the interesting thing of highly educated immigrants is that they specialize in science and technology much more than Americans do. And if you ask any economist, this is not controversial, the driver of growth of a country which is at the frontier like the US only can come from growth in science and technology. We cannot catch up with anybody. China can grow for a while, catching up to the American technology. If the US wants to grow, it has to progress. It has to grow in science and technology. So the fact that immigrants are in these fields massively ultimately has to be an important contributor of the US growth. I will propose some number at the end. But also, I would say, when we talk about high skill, we're talking about a resource that in the world is very sought after. So if the US does something to lose these brains, they're going to go elsewhere. They're not going to be there and waiting. So let me show you again some numbers, which I think are illustrated. This is the number of PhD that has been awarded from 1935 to 2005 in the United States. The top is the total. The blue are the US-born. The red are the foreign-born. You see two big increase in the number of PhD. This is in the period of the space race, the 65. So a lot of military spending, and this has increased a lot of PhD in physics and the sciences. And the second increase is the so-called information technology revolution. A lot of computer scientists, a lot of engineers. If you look at this second spike, you see that this all growth, essentially all the growth of PhD from 1975 to 2005 is all due to an increase in foreign-born. Americans have not increased, essentially, the number of PhD since 1965. In a sense, what has happened? Americans at a high level of education have become much more lawyer, businessmen, administration position, and they have been able to do this with large increase to the productivity because this very large stream of immigrants have kept sort of pushing up science and technology. This is patent innovation is the measure that economists use as the most effective measure of innovation, of new idea that come in the market. This is the share of patented innovation from 75 to 2005 in the United States due to foreign-born who are of European origin, Chinese, Indian, Hispanic, Russian, and Korean. Except for the European that goes slightly down, there is a massive increase in Chinese, Indian, and Hispanic, and a little bit of Russian and Korean in creating innovation. These are classified by the nationality of the main inventor. If you add up all this number, about 30%, 33% of the American innovation is due to foreign-born. 33% is massive, but even more striking is this, in my view. At the very, very top of science and the technology, there must be the Nobel Prizes in physics, chemistry, and medicine. This is the measure of how good or how many of the top minds are in one country. These are the cumulated Nobel Prizes from 1945 to 2006 in physics, chemistry, and medicine, the real sciences. So economics is out. Good enough. So this is the total United States. These are the first three countries, which are by far above. So this is the total United States. This is United Kingdom. This is Germany, and this is France. Now, the dotted dark line are foreign-born in the United States. So essentially, the United States adds the capacity of innovating to his country as large as the whole United Kingdom. So there are as many foreign-born Nobel laureates in the United States as there have been in total in the United Kingdom, which is the second most prolific country in terms of Nobel laureate. So you can think of it as the United States, by getting foreign-born people, has merged the world two biggest sort of creators of innovation, which are the US-born American plus the foreign-born American, and this clearly is an impressive number, and I don't think anybody will want to lose those. The battle for brain is international, really. Ultimately, if a lot of these people don't come to the US, there are countries out there who will die to have some of these. The UK has put in place a lot of policies in this land. Switzerland is very little mentioned, but for the EU is important. Switzerland is trying like crazy to attract. Just to give you an idea, this is the share of foreign PhD as percentage of the new incoming class. Sorry, this is really bad. You cannot read. I just underlined. The United States is still one of the countries with the largest, but this is Belgium, United Kingdom, and Switzerland are higher, and very near you have countries like Denmark. There is even Spain is actually, in fact, trying. So in the world, if the United States sort of makes it particularly difficult for some of these people to come, they will go elsewhere. So in the last 2 minutes, I just want to put these things together a little bit and just show you a couple of numbers. So I've showed you a lot of facts, a lot of suggestions that immigrants may actually benefit, both at the low end and at the high end. In a recent paper, I tried to sort of estimate what is the overall impact of immigration on the productivity and employment of US states, comparing states that receive a lot of immigrants and states that receive a few immigrants, trying to combine all these effects. Without going into detail, by the way, analyzing immigration across the states is very interesting because states in the United States have received a massively different percentage of immigrants. This is the average increase in percentage of immigrants in the US from 1960 to 2005. The red one is California, the state with the largest percentage. The blue one is West Virginia. West Virginia essentially has stayed at an incredibly low level. And so if you compare, West Virginia is different and many other, like if you take many southern states, they didn't have a very large increase. So if you look at the variation across the state, you can learn a lot. And let me conclude on this, telling you the number. So you should read, again, there is a lot of statistics behind this in which I try to separate the effect of immigration from effect of trade, technology, and blah, blah, blah. But the number that is there, you should read it as, so let's look at just the first two lines. The first line is the impact of an increase of immigration equal to 1% of the employment. So an inflow of immigrant, net inflow equal to 1% of employment. The impact in the short run all the way to the long run on the native employment. So if this number is negative and significant, this is a standard deviation. So if I put a star on this number, it means that immigrant penalize the employment of native if I get a negative and significant number. If I find a number with no star, it means that this effect is hard to distinguish from zero. If I find positive, it means that it has a positive effect. As you see, both in the short and in the long run, there does not seem to be appreciable effect of immigration on employment of native. Yesterday I gave a talk in which I was distinguishing between boom and recession. Maybe I will talk, but let's leave this aside. When you look at the impact on income per worker is the measure of productivity of an economy and is the main determinant of average income per person, you see that the effect starts being small, but that grows, and ultimately it accrues to some significant, so a 1% more immigrant means 1% more income per worker. And this strong increase in income per worker is mostly due to an increase in productivity. This is decomposing this into investment and productivity and the effect in productivity. So a lot of the story that I was telling you are actually sort of pan out with the number that they seem to show in the long run this positive effect. Let me say one important caveat and then I'm going to close. As Marshall said, nobody really cares about this number at the end. All that we do is based on anecdotes. And so, people say, yeah, you're right, but my neighbor has been displaced by a foreign-born. All right, sure. So it is sometimes, it's a little discouraging, but let me take it in the positive way. Economists now are starting to think that it's not enough to study the effect. What is really important for policy is to study what determine the attitude of native workers towards immigrants. And in a somewhat discouraging paper, if you want, but very interesting, Card, Dustman, and Preston, who are three very distinguished scholars of immigration, look at some survey in which people are asked, are you in favor of more or less immigrants? And then people are also asked, do you think immigrants hurt the economy? And then they're also asked, do you think immigrants are bad for our culture? So do you think diversity is good or bad? And what they find that the most important elements in determining the final position on immigration, so if they want more or less, is not really their perception of the economic effect, economic gain of losses, but the most important determinant is really the cultural perception. So if you have said immigrants, they're not too bad for the economy, but they're culturally not good for us, you're much more likely to want fewer immigrants. So 80% of the variation in the attitude towards immigrants seems to be driven from what people perceive other things than not economy. This is a little discouraging in a sense, because we think that we can make some cases, some economic cases for immigration, but I think also it's pushed people to try to understand more what determines this. Economy is important. In recession, people do fear immigrants more. So economy has to do with this, but addressing this is important. So in conclusion, I think immigration is an economic asset for the US in the long run. Is not bringing gains to all people in the same way. Probably it benefits more the highly skilled than the less. But in the long run, even at the low end of the education, doesn't seem to have a particularly negative effect. And certainly the attraction of brains should be one of the at least not hurting. There are brains who want to come to the United States no matter what, because this is a place where, the top schools are. At least not hurting them with an immigration policy would be an important thing. And I would say that an immigration policy that just allow people to pursue their American dream to come in and accept a little larger number of them would not be bad. So I think ultimately, really, the American dream is for people to come to the U.S. and fulfill their aspiration, but it is really for the U.S. as a country. This still summarizes. This is the inscription on the Statue of Liberty that used to greet people coming at the beginning of the century, in which the U.S. is sort of making this amazing statement of openness to immigrant by saying, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Thank you.
Well, gosh, what a wonderful act to try to follow. Terrific presentation. Well, an immigrant we're lucky to have. And it's a pleasure to be here on a panel with Giovanni, someone I've really admired and learned from for years. Marshall kind of summed up what I'm going to do in his little anecdotes about how legislators make their decisions. Giovanni's told you the truth about immigrants and the economy, the truth as understood by science, if only social science. I'm going to try to talk about how we here in the political realm are trying to deal with this truth. And the short answer is not very well. And if I was, I could just, if we weren't all here struggling and trying to deal with it, I might just leave it at that, not very well. But since we do all live here in the realm of politics and policy and the policy process, I'm going to try to elaborate that sad story in a little more detail, maybe in the hope that we can see some ways to change it. So the first question that comes up when you hear a presentation like this is, what does policy have to do with it? Did policy cause this in some way? How does policy figure into it? Giovanni hardly talked about policy at all. And the answer is, policy didn't really cause this, didn't really have very much, if anything, to do with this. Lots of immigration opponents would like you to think that, Senator Kennedy opened a spigot in 1965, and that's what's created the dynamics that they don't actually think are so positive, but that's what's created the dynamics. That's actually not true. Policy has very little to do with this. This is the product of deep-seated demographic and educational changes in the U.S. and abroad that create the space or create the possibility for a dynamic of the kind that Giovanni has just explained. Just to consider 4 factors among many, U.S. fertility we've been having smaller and smaller families, fewer and fewer babies. We're already actually at the point of just below replacement level. So we're not producing the kind of workforce that we would need to grow. In order to grow an economy, you need workers. Baby boomers, in fact, our workforce is actually in the process of getting, there are factors that are shrinking it. Massive numbers of baby boomers are about to retire. They're going to retire a little more slowly than they were going to retire 5 years ago, but they're still, within the next decade or so, 75 million baby boomers are going to drop out of the labor force. Even more important than the absolute numbers, think about our education, the changes in the American educational picture. And if you came to America in 1960 and you looked at the men of working age in the workforce, half of them would have been high school dropouts. Half of them. Well, if you look today at the men working age in the workforce, less than 10% are high school dropouts. So we're not creating the kind of workforce, not only even before you get to the dynamics that Giovanni just described, we have a need for low-end workers, and we have a need for high-end workers. And Giovanni showed this with other numbers, but if you go and you look at the science and engineering PhD programs in the U.S., 2/3 of the students in them are foreign-born. As Giovanni showed, Americans just aren't trying to be scientists and computer scientists and engineers. So those are the numbers that create the demand that then attract the supply that give rise to the dynamic that Giovanni described to you. Very little to do with government, has to do with much deeper kind of tectonic shifts in the kind of society we are. And the problem, and here we come back to policy, how has policy tried to grapple or take account of these shifts? Basically, policy has ignored them. Policymakers have put their head in the sand and ignored those trends. I often say I learn a lot, some of the smartest things I know about immigration policy from Border Patrol agents, because they, or think about it. I'll never forget the Border Patrol agent, out in the desert in Arizona as the sun set, who said to me, Tamar, you don't understand. We pass immigration law to keep one side happy. And that's the voters who actually want low numbers of immigrants because they're scared of immigrants for some of the cultural and economic reasons Giovanni talked about. We pass immigration law to keep one side happy, and then we ignore it to keep the other side happy. And the other side is all of us consumers who need these workers in the economy. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at that one side, other side misguided strategy. The basic facts are that and I'm talking about boom years for the moment. We'll come back and talk about recession years in a minute. But in boom years, about 1.5 million, 1.5 million foreign workers came to the U.S. every year to meet this demand we've been talking about. It's a very rough number. Don't argue with me about the specifics of the number, but 1.5 million roughly. We gave out about 1 million visas. So demand is attracting a supply of 1.5 million. Most of them working. They're doing 2 and 3 jobs, very productive. Visas were only giving out 1 million. It's as if we were making cars here and had to import the steel, but our steel quotas were a third too low. I mean, who would that benefit? And even those numbers are kind of misleading because that sounds, it's a third off. Consider the case of a few visa categories. At the high end, H-1B visas are the visas that, most of you probably know, the visas that high-end workers they often come temporarily at first before they get green cards. Well, in the past, in boom years, the day the high-end visas became available, they would be snapped up. The demand for them the visas for the year would be snapped up on the first day they were made available. That's how much the demand of the need was greater than the supply. And at the low end, even worse, if you're a Mexican worker and you have no family here, and you want to come to the U.S. to do unskilled work that's not on a farm, there are exactly 5,000 visas available for you. I mean, that's nothing. We need hundreds of thousands of that kind of worker in the economy. We give out 5,000 visas for them every year. work-related visas. So people figure out how to come. They come as family members instead of workers. They come on temporary visas and they figure out how to stay. They get by. But we're still, every year in a boom time, hundreds of thousands of workers short. By many estimates, 400 to 500,000 visas every year. And the cost of this gap between the need of the workers and the supply that's actually coming, right? I mean, the economy is in equilibrium. It's working it out. People are coming to take the jobs. And the number of visas available, that gap that the smugglers are filling, that's what creates all the costs that we know about immigration. You know, whether you're a liberal or conservative, whether you're concerned about the people running over the border or the deaths in the desert, you know, whether you're concerned about the crowded emergency room or the doctor who can't get a visa, whether you're concerned about people, you know, that you think are here illegally and that troubles you, or you're concerned about a whole society on the wrong side of the law, all those consequences, whatever bothers you about the broken immigration system, it's caused by that gap between the number of workers that supply and demand is generating and that we actually need, and where our what our visa ceilings are, which are about a third too low. Even more than that, costs and consequences of this bad policy, the numbers haven't changed in 20 years. Like, look at, you know, think about the past 20 years of the American economy, highs, lows, changes, the high-tech revolution. The basic numbers haven't changed in that 20 years. Tells you how bad a job Congress is doing. And the final consequence, which we're now seeing in Arizona and elsewhere, the public is rightly angry at the fact that a third of these people who are coming to work here are coming illegally. That ticks people off. They don't like that illegality. And so you're seeing this erosion of public confidence in the immigration system, which is almost as bad as the legal consequences. So, you know, sum up the consequences of this policy of you know, pass the law to keep one side happy and ignore it to keep the other side happy. It's really the dynamism of the world economy, kind of, you know, at our shores, if you will, and Congress is ignoring it. Congress is like, you know, the three monkeys, you know, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, you know, trying to cover their eyes and close their ears and ignore the dynamism of the world economy and the possible benefits that it could be creating. And, you know, the smart thing would be to craft a policy that takes account of that dynamism and that reality. And, you know, it would harness it. Of course, you would have to minimize the cost. There are costs. You know, we've been talking all about the benefits. There are costs, and you would have to figure out how to minimize the cost, but maximize the benefits, minimize the cost, and harness these benefits that Giovanni was talking about. That would be the smart thing to do. Until now, Congress hasn't managed it. So that's kind of the bad news. The somewhat better news is that, you know, and you all know this because you read the paper, since 2005, some lawmakers, I don't know if they've actually taken Marshall's rationality pill, which I love. I think we're going to start to market those rationality pills. But some lawmakers have been trying to grapple with this you know, this blindness, to this unrealistic policy. As you all know, and I don't think I have to go into the details, you know, comprehensive immigration reform, the idea is 4 pillars: border enforcement, work site enforcement, an answer for the 11 million unlawful people already here, and more visas to close that gap between the 1.5 million who are coming and the 1 million visas we give out. And the point is, all 4 of those parts go together as kind of the 4 moving parts of an engine. You know, of course we need better enforcement. The idea that we have this law that's so unrealistic that we don't even try to enforce, you know, the public is really sick of that. And as a country, I think we should rightly be sick of that. We need better enforcement. And of course we need an answer for the 11 million people already living here. But, you know, arguably most important, I would say, are those visas for workers to close that gap between the 1.5 million and the million, to take account of and accommodate and harness this reality that Giovanni has described. And it's important in and of itself, but it's also important because without that, you're not going to get very effective enforcement, right? Totally unrealistic law that ignores the reality of our economic needs and ignores the dynamism of the world economy, going to be very hard to enforce. That's how you're going to create a system for the future, is if you get that million and 1.5 million more lined up. And that's how you're going to avoid having another 11 million people on the wrong side of the law 10 or 20 years from now. Unfortunately, and now we're sort of sliding back into the troubling news, maybe this is the most troubling part of what I'm going to tell you, that need for the worker visas, that need to accommodate this reality, that's the least understood part of the reform, the least popular, the least embraced part of the reform, really by voters or I would say lawmakers. In 2006 and 2007, the last time we tried to pass comprehensive immigration reform, we did have visas to accommodate that gap, to make up that gap in the bill. Senator Kennedy and Senator McCain put visas to make up that gap in the bill. And when the bill got to the floor of the Senate, it was the first thing that got taken out or sunsetted or minimized or somehow compromised. An unholy alliance of anti-immigrant Republicans and pro-union Democrats, teamed up and said, we don't really need those workers. I'm looking at some congressional staffers in the room. Sorry, I can't help it. This year, and the trouble is that this year and next, this fight is going to, whenever we get to comprehensive immigration reform next, this fight might be even harder than it was in 2006 and 2007. For obvious reasons, we're in a 10% unemployment economy. And the truth is the 10% unemployment economy, the recession hasn't changed any of the dynamics I described, having to do with population or education or why we need immigrants. And it certainly hasn't changed any of these dynamics that Giovanni has described. So recession has changed the short-term demand somewhat. We're building a little fewer houses and people are eating out less in restaurants. So there's a short-term change in demand. Even so, even in the recession, there are a lot of industries that still need their immigrant workers. Americans still aren't, unemployed automakers aren't driving from Detroit, auto workers aren't driving from Detroit out to pick fruit in Washington State, and people aren't going from their, when you get fired from one of the communications heavy jobs that Giovanni described, people aren't necessarily going to do heavy manual work. So there's been, even in the recession, there's still some demand for some immigrant workers, but most importantly, those basic dynamics that we're talking about haven't changed. And as soon as the economy starts to rebound again, we're going to need those workers again. But in this climate, the rationality quotient is even lower among voters and lawmakers. And so the idea that, we're going to need immigrant workers to make the economy more productive and dynamic, very hard case to make. And there was one bill, and I won't attribute this to all Democrats in Congress, but there was a bill introduced in December that was kind of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Democrats' proposed comprehensive immigration reform that virtually had no workers, visas for workers in it. So, again, the most important part of reform, the key gap that you have to close, and yet there was a major bill introduced in December that didn't address it. So, some of us, the better news, I guess, is that there are people here in Washington trying to fight that mentality, even in a down economy. And there are champions in Congress who understand that we have to fight that mentality, and are working to even again, when are we going to get to comprehensive immigration reform? Who knows? But people in both houses of Congress who are working to say, well, we do need these worker visas, and we do need to figure out a way to make the case for them, even in a down economy. We're not fixing the immigration system just for this year. We're fixing the immigration system for, we hope decades to come. Let's try to create a way to get some of those workers, or a pipeline for those workers, into a bill. There were Lindsey Graham, who was the Republican champion of reform, who was working closely with Charles Schumer, the Democratic champion of reform, all through the past year, understood that reality very strongly. And there was there were talks between business and labor for some of last year, trying to think about, well, is there some way for business and labor to compromise on this and to come up with a system that could give us some worker visas. Without going into the details of those negotiations, and I certainly don't want to talk about them publicly or give anything away, just some of the ideas kind of floating around in the air about what would a compromise look like. How would we take account in policy of this need that Giovanni's demonstrated? A couple of ideas. The pipeline for workers should probably be flexible. So in times of a bad economy and high unemployment, the pipeline probably would shrink. You wouldn't need so many immigrants. Whereas in good times, in times of low unemployment, the pipeline would expand. And again, that sounds obvious, right? But in the past 20 years, the pipeline hasn't changed at all. We had static limits, flat line, didn't change. So one sort of idea pretty much agreed upon across the spectrum is let's have a flexible pipeline for workers. Another idea that's kind of floating around, kind of catching on among a lot of different kinds of people, is maybe that old distinction between temporary workers and permanent workers. Maybe that's too rigid. Maybe if you look at how people actually operate in the real world, both at the low end of the economy and at the high end of the economy, both your Mexican, busboy who comes and works in the kitchen for a few years and your Indian scientist, people actually, the real world is people come for a short time to make some money, to get an education, to try it out, to see if it works, and then some stay and some go home. And it's actually usually the more successful ones who stay, right? Think about it. If it's too cold here and the work's too hard and you don't really understand your American boss, you probably go home. Whereas if you're rising up from being busboy to being the cook, you might stay. And similarly at the high end. So a new idea that's kind of floating around is provisional workers. So people would come temporarily and then graduate. Then there'd be some mechanism where they'd prove themselves, graduate to be permanent, to get permanent visas. Of course, I think people on both sides of the debate agree that employers have to look for Americans first. And we have to figure out some way to really demonstrate that's streamlined, not too complicated, not too bureaucratic, but to demonstrate that they try to find American workers first. Of course, you want a system where you have to treat both immigrants and native-born fairly and treat them the same. You can't have a system where you're treating the immigrant workers differently. And maybe another sort of key policy idea, the old idea of temporary workers is the employer finds you, the employer brings you to the U.S., and you're basically, for want of a better word, his, as long as you stay in the U.S., kind of indentured servant sort of model. The new thinking is, well, that really isn't right. We can't go down that route in 21st century America. And the key answer to that is what we call a portable visa. Martin Luther King used to say, as long as you can vote, that's the key to all your other civil rights. Well, in this realm of worker visas, a visa that you, the worker, own rather than the employer owns. So, maybe you have to work for the employer for a little while if he went to all the trouble to sponsor you and bring you here. But then you can take your visa and, if you don't like him, you can say, sorry, boss, I'm taking my visa and I'm going to work for the guy down the street. And that's really going to be kind of the essence of your bargaining power. And so that's kind of a key idea at the center of some of the thinking. I'm running out of time here, but the bottom line is that I think business and labor and some of the lawmakers that are thinking about this are trying to look for a compromise. There's no real understanding yet of what the numbers would look like, of how big this pipeline would be, and ultimately that's the key question, right? Are we talking about anything that comes close to closing that gap between the million and the 1.5 million, and will it be realistic? And second of all, how will you decide what those numbers are? Will Congress just set it, if Congress sets one limit now, how will you make it flexible? How will you bring in that flexibility? And I think I am running out of time, so maybe I won't go. I was going to talk a little more about that, but the basic answer is that the statistics that measure employment need around the country, the Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps them, they're not really helpful, right? So you think, well, maybe we could look at the numbers and that would tell us how many workers we need. Well, if you want to know how many carpenters are unemployed in Minneapolis, is it reasonable to bring in some immigrant workers there? The numbers for carpenters in Minneapolis, the most recent numbers we have are 2 years old. Well, that's not very helpful if I'm trying to build a house in Minneapolis and I go to the government, I say I want some workers, and they say, well, let me look at the statistics to see if you actually need to get a foreigner. Well, 2-year-old data isn't really going to help. So the question is, how are we going to figure that out? And the big debate between unions and business and here in town is, should we create a government commission to try to figure out that answer? And without going into the details, I can talk about more in Q&A. Labor's for that commission. Business says that's what brought down the Soviet Union. How can you take an economic decision and put it in the hands of some politically unaccountable bureaucrats rather than the market? How could they possibly decide? And so that is a big unresolved issue that you're going to hear more about as the debate goes forward. Basically, I think I am kind of hopeful, even though we're in a bad moment right now, I think the chances of comprehensive immigration reform happening between now and the November elections are, slim to nil. I actually am somewhat more hopeful that it will happen in early 2011. I am hopeful that business and labor will come to a deal on some of these tricky worker visa questions. Business and labor, they come to deals in America every day. They come to a deal somewhere in America. So, I think we could get to a deal on this. I think it is a compromisable issue. And I think, the problem with the hope and the problem with early 2011 is that, that's really going to be our only window for the next few years. If Congress doesn't get to this in early 2011, once we get into the kind of election year, the presidential election year politics of 2012, I think we're really out of luck. So it's sort of next spring is the window. I'm more hopeful than some others about what could happen next spring, especially, they're two different, Republicans could have two different attitudes. They could come back from a big win in November and say, we said no for 2 years and we were rewarded with a landslide. Let's go on saying no to Democratic proposals. And that's one possibility, and that would not be very encouraging. Then we probably would not get this solved. But Republicans could come back in November and they could say, well, we won big, but now is our chance to kind of repeat 1994 and 95, where we came back and we said, let's solve some things on our terms, bring a Democratic president our way, and get some things behind us. And I think, Republicans, as much as Democrats, understand that this is, or increasing numbers of Republicans, let's put it that way, understand that this is an issue that they do need to get behind us, that we as a country need to solve. So, in closing, I'll come back to try to marry my hope or reconcile my hope with that image of, the dynamic world economy and the congressmen, that are like the three monkeys hiding under their desk and trying to hide from that reality. Horrifying as that image is, and true as it is, that's really what's been true for the last, 10, if not 20 years, congressmen trying to hide from this dynamic economic reality that Giovanni's described. I have more faith in Congress than that. I have more faith in Congress, and I have more faith in American voters that people are going to grasp this, that we do have to do something about this reality. Voters already grasp we do have to do something about the reality of the 11 million workers already here. I think, before too long, Congress is going to step up to the plate and come to terms with the reality that Giovanni described.
Thank you both so much. All right, so now we have some of the data that Congress may decide to ignore. And we've got policy prescriptions and predictions. The floor is now open for your questions. We have people coming around with microphones, so if you would like to ask a question, please wait for the microphone to get to you, and then please identify yourself. Who would like to start us off? Marshall.
I don't need a mic. I can talk loud.
Well, I think for the benefit of the webcast people, you do need a mic. Thanks.
Tamar, Arizona, in the politics of a comprehensive immigration reform, arguments that it will push comprehensive reform and arguments that it will kill comprehensive reform. Where do you come down on that?
I don't have I always often joke, if I had a crystal ball, I would be in a more profitable line of work. But I think Arizona has done good in the sense that it has really woken up the country to the urgency of the problem. I do this all day long every day, and for the past 2 years, I felt like I was kind of off in an ivory tower studying something that most Americans weren't that concerned about. Now, every time I turn on a TV or go into a restaurant, someone at the next table is talking about immigration, and that's a good thing. Raising up the saliency of the issue and reminding people that it needs to get solved, reminding people that it's broken, that's a good thing. What's troubling me about Arizona is that it's sharpening the polarization of the debate. My deepest concern is that we're going to go out of the realm of rationality, that rationality pill, these numbers, thought about the problem, and get more and more into a kind of polarized, emotional, political football situation where not only the public sees it as an emotional issue, but voters are exploiting those emotions. LBJ used to have a question he would ask lawmakers: do you want a bill, meaning do you want a compromise, a solution, a fix, or do you just want an issue, meaning something you can go, like a red flag you can wave to the bull when you need to go and get reelected again? And I'm kind of worried that immigration, we're sliding more and more from an issue to from a bill, from something to solve, to being a political wedge issue. And the way that political wedge issue divides is: are you for amnesty or are you for enforcement? And in my view, immigration reform has to have both. But we're getting to a point where people are seeing this debate as, are you for amnesty? Are you for enforcement? And unfortunately, the Arizona debate is kind of elevating that divide and in a troubling way.
All right, are there questions? I want to ask a question here, just since there aren't a great many hands yet, and I know that what happens is that people gradually think of their questions and then the hands go up. But to kind of bring that process along, Giovanni, you spoke about the question of perception, which is clearly so important, and emphasized that it's the cultural impact that you see as perhaps more important than the fear of jobs being taken away. And Tamar, you talked about what it is that policymakers do and do not respond to. But I'm wondering, is there not another player in all this? Is it not the media and the impact of what the media is doing with data or not doing with the data, and then the impact that that has on perceptions, popular perceptions? So could either of you or both of you just talk about that a little bit?
I just say a couple of words.
Go ahead,
yeah.
please.
So yes, I think. So let me answer again as a scholar more than which is what I know. So I think the need to understand the impact of the media on the perception and on the attitude of people is a critical point. The studies that people have done so far have identified some feature of people that seem to be associated with a higher. So, for instance, it comes systematically true that people with a higher education, urban people, and younger people seem to have opinion and attitude which are more open towards immigration. So, just generalizing again and putting sort of a coefficient in a statistical regularity. I think what economists, political scientists, journalists are doing in part, but I don't know if anything really final scientific has been done, is to try to understand how much different media, TV, mostly television and journalists have affected the impact of people. I know that there are some people who are studying this, even economists, but I think this will be a key thing, and I think that ultimately maybe some politician will be also interested. I do agree. I mean, we do need also as academic to go a little bit just from the pure fact into this realm of decision. I think Tamar is right that each one does their job, and politicians sort of have been ignoring us. We have been ignoring them. Maybe I see in academia how we are so wrapped up sometimes about some of our internal contention on the estimate of one particular wage effect that we lose a little bit the big picture. So this bridge, I think it's good that it goes both ways.
I think the media heightens the kind of emotional and political aspect of the public's reaction, but I don't think the media can make stuff up. The media is kind of shines a spotlight and amplifies, and maybe amplifies some of the worst thinking, but I think ultimately you have to look to kind of public attitudes. And we just did my organization just did some focus groups on a national poll that lined up with some other polling that's been done. But it was very interesting because it did show that the public isn't sure that immigrants help America. I mean, actually, in fact, if you take the public as a whole, they think that immigrants hurt the country more than they help, by about 55 to 45%. And those are sort of troubling findings. And that's kind of what we see out there. They're afraid of it. And Republicans think that they hurt America more than Democrats do, but even white Democrats, they're not really sure that immigrants really help America. And they're not even sure, and we did some focus groups, and it was a little bit scary. We asked about low-skilled immigrants, and we asked about high-skilled immigrants. And the question that I just, couldn't believe, we said, well, the guy who invented the Pentium chip, isn't it better that he did it in America than in India? He's an Indian. Isn't it better that he did it here? And focus groups weren't sure, which is just, terrifying. But despite this, despite the fact that they're not sure immigrants help or hurt, and that told me that the pollster was asking the right question, because we kind of know there is that ambivalent out there. Huge majorities think this is a problem that needs to be fixed. 80, 90%. And they think it, with a lot of intensity, and that's what pollsters look at most. Do you feel strongly that it needs to be fixed? And so 70-80% feel strongly that it needs to be fixed. 87% would like to see their member of Congress working on it. I mean, most members of Congress, as I say, they're hiding under their desks. They think they shouldn't go near. But 87% of voters, Democrat and Republican, said, I want my member of Congress working on this. And they were very supportive of, what you might call a rational plan. It has to be heavy with enforcement, both in the border and in the workplace. They're okay with a certain number of worker visas coming here. It's not the part they like the best, but they can kind of live with that. And they're okay, and this is Democrats and Republicans, with, some answer for the 11 million. And when it was really interesting because we thought maybe we were expecting hostility to the 11 million. And so we asked people first, leaving that part of the answer out. We just said, so what if we just did enforcement on the border and enforcement in the workplace, and we created a way for some workers to come in the future? Would you like that? And people say yes, yes, yes. And these are in focus groups, Democrats and Republicans, yes, yes, yes. And so then we say, what's wrong with it? And actually, Republican voters raise their hand, and they say, you've left out the 11 million. What are you going to do about them? Which is really encouraging, because it just shows that the public, again, so I'm not, in a way, my answer to Marshall is, we need the rationality pill, but we also need the realism pill. And the answer is a lot of voters, maybe they haven't taken the rationality pill yet, but they have kind of taken the realism pill. And to me, that's encouraging.
Thank you. Okay, now the hands are going up. Terrific. Okay, why don't we start? There's a hand up. The lady right there. I'm sorry, I don't know your names, which is one of the reasons you need to identify yourself. Yes, please. And then we'll go to this gentleman in the front.
Thanks. Dr. Margaret Archowski. I'm the congressional correspondent for the Hispanic Outlook on Higher Education. And I wrote a book on immigration called Immigration and the American Dream. And I talk a lot about the history of immigration law, which pulls into what you're saying a lot, because it's interesting that, of course, immigration law for most of our history was made out of the Labor Committee. It was about labor, and it looks like we're kind of getting back to that. But I think what's missing in a lot of talk I hear, of course, immigration become extremely Latino-centric. And, of course, and being from California, that seemed natural to me. But coming here, you get to realize immigration's about everybody. It's not just about Latinos. And I think sometimes when you guys are talking about immigration, it sounds like it's just about Latinos and just about illegals, and of course it isn't. So I'm glad you're talking about work visas. What I'm curious about is that in 1965, when we had that tremendous change in immigration law and Kennedy push for it, the biggest thing was getting rid of the national quota. That was so anti-American to say we preferred Protestants from Northern Europe. So they got rid of that. But what he did, what Kennedy did, to say it in modern terms, is he committed to diversity. And he said that there's no country can have more than 7% of all the visas. And that anybody from any religion, any country could come here. Now, you never hear that. It's like, mainly you talk about Mexicans. I mean, what about Peruvians? What about El Salvadorians? I'm not sure if Fox was including El Salvadorians. I miss a broad immigrant picture. It just seems like, and often you polarize it, Tamara. You said, the Arizona thinks between amnesty versus enforcement. No, I'm hearing people want enforcement first, then they'll consider amnesty. So I think you can help the polarizing by not making it so it's either this or this. That's not what people are saying. They think it's broken because it hasn't been enforced. Let's have enforcement first, then we'll consider amnesty, and not blanket amnesty for, people who, maybe as you said, people who are successful, people who are worthy. So I think you have to watch the rhetoric too. But I would love to hear you talk more about the broad immigration issues, not just illegal Latinos.
Well, I think, I'm not sure what the question is and all that. I take the points. I think both of our presentations, we tried to talk about both high end and low end. I mean, the problem with the 65 law, which, in many ways did take what had been a horrible system that was about national origin quotas and try to rationalize it, was it, again, is where was the sort of, had Congress taken the reality pill in 1965? Because to say that every country in the world should have a similar percentage of the visas, that ignores the reality of how people move around the world. 80% of the well, let's see, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but it's half of the immigrants, legal and illegal, living in the U.S. come from Latin America right now, and a quarter come from Asia. So if you just say we're going to have the same pigeonhole for every country, you're giving, Monaco the same number of visas as Mexico, and that's wrong, not just because the countries are so different in size and so different in proximity, but because people don't wake up in the morning in Monaco or in, Senegal or wherever and say, gee, I think I'm going to go to the U.S. today. People come to the U.S. because they have relatives here, or because someone in their family came before, or because there are networks and realities that drive how people come to the U.S. And that's just reality, good or bad. The sun rises. We can do some things. We may or may not want to even mitigate the effects of those realities. But the point is, and I'm not saying that should mean that we have only Mexican come and no Pakistanis. I mean, we do want different kinds of skills. You do want to, again, maximize the benefits and minimize the cost of the reality. But the 1965 law just pretended the reality didn't exist. And I think, that was short-sighted. It wasn't ill-willed. It was just short-sighted.
I personally, I don't think I ever, in all my slides, I make a point. My research is all about foreign-born. I divide them by skill, by education, by occupation, try to see. And it's true that different ethnic group or different country of origin are represented differently in the spectrum. All the benefits and all the impact I was talking about really come from the totality, but from considering all the immigrants. And really, when, again, maybe because I'm an economist and I focus on labor market, what really I look at and study are skills and productivity. And that is, varies, but it has no nationality attached at all.
Thank you. The gentleman here, and then we'll go to the other side of the room.
Thank you. My name is J.J. Smith. Whenever I hear about immigration, I always think about what George Washington had to say about it. To me, it sums it up in one sentence. He said this as President of the United States, that our shores shall be unassailable, but our harbors or ports shall be open to the needy and oppressed of the world. And if you kind of take that big picture, I'd like to ask Tamar a question, more or less paraphrase what I heard you say, and hope it turns into a question. But 1.5 million people coming in here, 1.5 million people coming in here, 1 million visas issued. The conclusion is, you said there's some exceptions, but that 500,000 are illegal immigrants. Probably understates the number of illegal immigrants. So what is wrong with a policy that would sort of loosen up those visas and have more people come in here legally? I would assume if they come in here legally, they become taxpayers, rather than become a burden to us in terms of our educational system and our healthcare system. They are now taxpayers, and they're self-financing. So what would be wrong, and maybe it's a reality pill, what would be wrong with trying to open up and loosen up those visa requirements? Now, the requirements, I would think, I'm sure we can get in a debate a long time about what would be the requirements to be issued a visa. Having a criminal record, well, maybe, maybe not. Shoplifting, is that really a bad thing? So I don't want to really get into a discussion about what would be the requirements, just kind of your reaction to my hearing what you had to say.
That's exactly what I think the answer is trying to adjust that flow, the number of visas that we issue to be more realistic in terms of what our economic needs are. And so the place I'd sort of revise, wash my mouth out with soap, but edit George Washington a little bit is it's not about our ports open to need of the needy of the immigrants. This is about our needs. This is about our interests. That's kind of where I think sometimes we look at this the wrong way. This is not about compassion for immigrants or oppressed outside of the country. This is about our needs to be a prosperous, growing, dynamic country, needing the labor at the bottom and the top of the economy. But I'm with you. More visas for workers.
Okay. The gentleman over here, please.
Yes.
Will you wait for the microphone, please?
So hopefully I can remember my question because it came.
I'm sure you can remember your name. So
right. So my name's. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me. I'm Kreshnik Begoli. I'm one of the Merage Fellows, first-year fellow this year. Immigrant myself, came to the U.S. when I was 17, turned 18 here. My question was about the perceptions of immigrants by the U.S. And I think you try to maybe figure out, I'm trying to figure out why do people in the U.S. have these perceptions? What are your maybe hypothesis, or if there's any analysis? I think you try to probe into that with the question about media. But if it's not really media, if you don't think it's media, where do you think these perceptions come from, and why do you think they're there? The other thing that I wanted to ask, since I already have the mic, is also the perception of why do we think that there's not enough work for immigrants in the U.S.? So if you're saying that there's a need for more visas and more people to be working here, we can absorb this immigrant population, why isn't that understood by the more larger population? Because personally, I'm an immigrant myself, and I don't even know whether there's a need for more immigrants to be in the workforce or not. So yeah.
So about the perception, let me put this in perspective a little bit, because here we're talking about the U.S. a lot. Let's look at the world. Let's look at Europe. Let's look at Japan. The perception of many rich countries about immigrants is very often very tough. If you look at the polls in Europe and the attitude of many policymakers in Europe, not to talk about Japan, which is even more extreme, a lot of rich countries sort of see this, they want to maintain their integrity of culture, value, and economy in a sense. So in this perspective, the U.S. is an exception towards a more accepting country. Definitely. There is a history of immigrant. It's a country which is based on immigrant differently from Germany or Italy or Spain, which only recently have faced this issue. And so I think there is an attitude which is much more. So when you look at these samples, it's never an 80-20 split. I mean, people who see the positive, there is some maybe 45-55 people see that. Now, I think there are some circumstances and some prevalence of anecdote that generates this. So one is, again, this seems pretty regular in times of economic crisis, in times of economic hardship. People tend to find some reason, and tend to become harsher, tougher towards immigrants. It seems that the jobs are decreasing for everybody, and therefore, there are fewer of them even for the immigrants. So I think part of it is fluctuating a little bit, but in part is also driven by the fact, I think, that a lot of these channel and this fact that I am showing and that we're looking are not so direct. If you just know a person who used to be a construction worker, and now you see that all construction workers are Spanish, it's easy in your mind to just make the association, and it's much harder to see the indirect business that they create, this complementarity. So I think there are some natural reason because for which people tend to be afraid of people who they don't know very much. They tend to have a sense of ownership towards their country, and I think that's why, though, information, education, it's very important in terms of shaping the opinion and the attitude of people on this respect. So I would say, I mean, so that for the perception. In terms of needing more worker, or so it is very true that in the last couple of years there has been a large number of jobs that has been destroyed by the recession. And so again, I would also be very much in favor of a system in which the number of immigrants which is admitted fluctuates. So probably in 2008 and 2009 there was not the need, and we would have not have admitted as many immigrants as we did in the early 2000s if we had such a system which could adjust to the demand for labor market. But believe me, there are a lot of these, so there are a lot of studies of economists that try to project and look at what type of occupation, what type of jobs will have employment growth. As I was looking recently, in the last 15 years, a very large large number of jobs in the United States, besides that on the professional end, high end, has been created in these pretty non-tradable manual type of jobs. So restaurant services, gardening services. These are jobs which are demanded very much and more as the population becomes older and rich, and for which there have been, the vacancies have been very tight, and the labor market has been relatively tight, so demanding a lot of jobs. Of course, currently there is no legal way of having an immigrant, a low-skilled immigrant, to come to this country to do this type of job unless you have a member of the family. So that's the type of thing on which economy can tell us. We can measure how tight the labor markets are. I am for an even more drastic idea of letting, auctioning this visa, but we'll talk about another time. But I think there are some important things that we can bring to the debate, and yes, the perception is an important part.
I'm for fees for the visa, by the way, opposed to the auction. We should talk about that somewhere. But,
yeah,
the Woodrow Wilson will take a % of the profit.
I'm sure that.
But on the perceptions, I mean, I think it's important not to demonize them, right? So it's important to try to understand them. And people, even though America, I mean, what Giovanni says about America versus Europe and Japan is true. Even though America is a more diverse place, people sort of have a sense of what the country is and what the culture is and they're afraid of changing it. And what I say is that if they were right about what the changes were likely to be, and if their fears were right, then you would have to sort of recognize them. If you said, well, is our politics soon going to look like Mexican politics, right? Is our, police, the attitudes of the police toward the public and the public toward the police, is it soon going to be like Mexico? Are we going to have a situation where we're going to have a country where there's two different tiers of, the educated people who speak English and the not educated people who speak another language, and the social divisiveness that comes with that? If you thought they weren't going to basically integrate and accommodate and, whatever word you want to use for that, you might be right to be afraid. I mean, there's a scenario that if you don't actually know what's going to happen, would be troubling. The good news is they do want to become Americans and they do learn the language, and we're not heading, like generations of immigrants before. Our politics aren't going to look like Mexicans. They're coming here because they like our attitudes better, or they come to work and they stay because they like our transparent democracy better. But if you don't understand, if you just think, well, we're going to become like that, we're going to have that level of change, it's understandable that people are anxious about it. People are anxious about change. And so it is about, a lot of the rationality pill, I think, is about trying to educate people on that score, and that's hard to do. I think one of the big things that we can do is point to how successful immigrants are here, and that it isn't that they're dragging us down. In fact, they're lifting us up. On the economy, I think the perceptions come from the fact that people do sometimes look back to a different era, and they think, well, when I was a kid, I worked in the soda fountain during the summer. I wanted to work in the restaurant in the summer or at the gas station or whatever. And why don't they do that now? They don't realize that kids, even teenagers, don't really want to do that kind of work in the summer now. And that, so there's this perception. Well, if they only paid $1 more, my cousin would do it. And you actually say, well, would you take those jobs? Would your kids take those jobs? And they know, no, my kid doesn't want to clean toilets at a hotel, please, But they think that if you just paid a little more, some American would. And again, it's just hard to disabuse people of those myths, but that's kind of what our job is.
Marshall, I know you want to get in, but I'm going to ask you to hold off just for a minute because we have so many hands up. There's that lady in the back, please. Thank you.
Paula Durbin from the Inter-American Foundation. I have two questions. One, with respect to a remark made earlier, is it accurate to assume that all illegal immigrants do not pay taxes? I saw something about $7 billion a year in Social Security alone that they'll never collect. And second, since you've mentioned the A word, what is the thinking on amnesty?
I'll take a crack and then Giovanni. Yes, most the Social Security Administration doesn't know for sure, because this is the whole point. These are people off the books, and so how do you account for it? But upwards of 75%, and I don't know if it's 80 or more, employers who hire unlawful immigrants do go through the whole process of taking out income tax, taking out Social Security tax. That $7 billion is the number that comes into the Social Security Administration every year. it's not all immigrants, but it's people paying in to a number that doesn't match. So a large percentage of it are immigrants, and of course immigrants pay sales tax, right? Everything they buy, and they mostly pay property tax because they pay a rent that has property tax included in it. So it's not true that immigrants don't pay taxes. It is true that legalization would make sure they paid their full freight in taxes, and that is something that appeals to the public, so I think that's a little difference that advocates emphasize. Well, they also, exactly, yes, fair enough.
Yeah.
But, and what was your other question?
Amnesty.
Amnesty, oh, amnesty. Well, I mean, yeah, and I should never have used the word, but I was trying to describe the polarization. The public is, poll after poll after poll has showed that if you combine legalization with enforcement, what the public is really concerned about is getting control of the system, getting to a rational system, and if you combine enforcement is the public's first priority: border enforcement and workplace enforcement. They want the rule of law observed. They want a controlled legal system. If you combine some sort of legalization program with adequate enforcement, and you make conditions to get to legalization, having a job, learning English, what have you, the public is supportive. And it's just there've been dozens of polls that show that. The interesting thing is one of the conditions that's also often thrown in is pay your back taxes. That's one that we found in our focus groups. People say, well, how could you do that? That's unrealistic. So that's something that's thrown in as a condition meant to address people's concerns, that people say, again, well, could that really work? And again, I find that encouraging because it's that reality pill. People trying to think through, they're here, we're not sending them home, we can't send them home, we've got to figure out some answer.
If I can add one thing on the taxes, just because, yeah, I agree with Tamar on the taxes. There are actually some recent studies. It's a little hard to quantify, but I've seen some recent studies pretty well done. One for the state of Georgia by some people at the Fed of Atlanta, who actually were trying to measure the income, the tax income from these social security numbers that don't correspond, which are fake, and matching them with the number of estimated undocumented, and in that paper they came out with an estimate of 90% to all seem to be putting some money into this pool that obviously is going to end up. I'm not even clear how this money are used, but certainly they don't go back to them in Social Security. So I mean, a lot of them are paying taxes. For some people, they were saying they almost hope that this could establish a record for them if the A word comes. So.
Yeah, we've got two questions. There's a person sitting behind the table back there, sitting on the side, and then after that, the person who's at the table with a hand up, please.
Hi, my name is Matin, medical student at Stanford. I had a question. There was a lot of data in terms of economic and how that corresponds to immigrants. I was wondering how to actually translate into healthcare, because I do a lot of work with the immigrants, and in many of the free clinic, we see like 300 patients a day, and a lot of them don't have insurance. And the reason that there's such a high cost is because they usually wait till it gets to an emergency to actually have it treated. And the cost is always much greater than prevention. And I was wondering if there's any data regarding that and how that affects the financial in terms of the economy, and if there's any solution or it has been even looked at yet.
So for what I know, so this is an important point. From what I know, it is there are only surveys, so it is very hard. So the reason why in my economic analysis I didn't go too much, I stuck to the labor market, and I didn't go too much into the calculation of the cost and benefits in terms of some publicly provided good to immigrants, of which healthcare would be one, education would be another, is that it has been incredibly hard to really establish or measure First, the amount of use of healthcare of immigrants, undocumented in particular. So as you say, essentially they're only eligible to emergency room type of treatment. Some people say that this brings them to overuse the emergency cares room. But most of the survey I've seen seems to say that they don't do preventive care, and they also underuse the emergency room because they're scared, quote unquote, with clearly some health consequences. I don't know of anyone. I mean, there is a branch of economics, which is health economics, that really also quantify. I mean, of course, there is the human part of it, but there is also the economic part, that these people are working, their health is deteriorating as a consequence of this, and so even from a productive point of view, this is a downside. I know of some survey and some anecdotal study. I don't know of a systematic one. My feeling is that it's incredibly hard to find any hard data. So people have taken, I don't know, I have in mind one study done in Boston, in fact, about this, and in that they really it really appears that there is a massive underuse of healthcare, even in relatively extreme situation, which is very bad news and is one of the consequences of this undocumented. I mean, if anything, this may argue that there is this further pressure of trying to do something about this. Sorry, wait, say it again. I would feel like free clinics. Free clinics. More than 99% of them are actually immigrants. And I also, that in terms of the future, like looking at this healthcare, and from my understanding, that they're also still left out. So I don't feel like it's been even though it's a vital part of human beings naturally healthy, and the fundamental thing, I don't think it's at all medicine and healthcare. Yeah, I agree. I think we don't know too much, and I think it would be very interesting.
And we also haven't talked about the involvement of immigrants, both documented and undocumented, in elder care and the burgeoning part of the economy that's there. I mean, that could also be spoken about. Yes, thank you.
Vivek Namana, I'm a Merage Fellow. So, you talked about how there's a conflict between the supply and demand for labor when it comes to immigrants, and also how hard it is to measure exactly how many visas we need to give out. It just seems to me like a textbook example of where government interference in a free market prevents an equilibrium. So why even have a visa system? Why can't we have it 100% open borders and let the market decide?
Welcome to Washington and Congress and politics. I would argue that the market is in equilibrium now. The only problem is a third of it is black market. And the problem is that politically you just can't go there to no borders. People are just too afraid of that, and they don't trust the market. And I think that really is one of the fundamental things here. People just don't trust the market to come into equilibrium, and it's it's just one of those things that's beyond sort of most people's belief. And so just politically, the idea of not having limits is a complete non-starter. And so what some of us have argued for a long time is, can we come up with a system where the limits are kind of riding on the market almost? So the market's creating a flow. Can we create limits that kind of skim off them almost, or maybe are just a little below? How can we come up with a mechanism like that? And that's what I think auction is aiming at, and I think that's certainly what I'm aiming at with a fee. And it's just very hard to, what voters and lawmakers want to do is, build have a number that you can kind of nail to the wall, and I don't think we're going to win that one. So it's sort of about how can we come up with a way for them to be a number that at least is flexible.
Can I add another? So I think there was a time in which the U.S. had really no border, which is up to 1880, and really between 1880 and 1910, the regulation was very, very little. There are some economists that say that one key reason, this is Milton Friedman citing, why you cannot really have a free migration in the modern state is the welfare state. So back then, essentially, the government was not redistributing wealth much. Until the 1920s, the government was almost uninvolved. And so if you only have private transactions, yes. But then the government started redistributing, and now in the US, maybe 25%, in some European countries, 50, 60% of the economy is is controlled by the government, meaning that is going to tax the rich to redistribute, is going to be involved. In that case, you can see how a country, a relatively rich country, in which potentially a lot of people at a level of skill and income which is much lower than the current will come in, will generate this massive redistribution, and how the median voter in the United States will be very worried about this massive redistribution that this can generate, even if the private market could absorb this situation. But so we're not operating really in a free market society. The government is controlling a lot, and in this type of environment, I myself you have to go to a second best. Open border, besides being unrealistic, I think ultimately will generate economic consequences which are going to be too massive for the median voter to take. And so the alternative is to get a limit, regulate it, to me find the right price for these permits so that the demand can clear supply. But I don't think that the open border can really work.
But let's be clear. Despite welfare state, even legal immigrants are very restricted in what kinds of government benefits they can get, for their first 5 or 10 years here. And illegal immigrants don't get any kind of. They can use the roads and they can use the emergency room and they can go to K through 12 education. But let's not give a.
True. That's true.
I agree with the general point, but let's not give a misunderstanding of.
No, that is not. There are a lot of studies that actually there is this also idea that the United States, that immigrants come to the U.S. To collect welfare, and there are this very good study from an economist on Columbia that studied how different states changed their welfare to immigrants, and showed that essentially the response of immigrants moving from one state to another is very small to welfare measure, while the labor market conditions are much more important. So immigrants to the U.S. in the very large part come really for jobs, not for welfare.
Right, let's go to the lady sitting in the back, and then we'll go to the gentleman here, and then Marshall will get to you again, okay?
Okay. My name is Tiffany Murphy. I'm from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown, seconded from state. And this kind of brings us back to the question of, which was addressed a little bit earlier, of possible commission. And I'm curious from both perspectives, both from an economic as well as policy, how that's being kind of played with on the Hill, seeing as we haven't adjusted anything in 20 years. And, getting a more informed decision-making on these issues in a shorter period of time, on a yearly or bi-yearly or every 5 years or something that's more responsive to the labor market, both in boom and bust times.
I have no say on what the Hill does. I have no idea. I can tell you that there are a lot of economists out there who so many think that one of the not good, of the worst aspect of the current laws is that there are these caps which are set and can only be changed by Congress. This is an incredibly cumbersome procedure, while having a more independent committee that, again, either decides how to auction this, or at least decides how to revise this cap up and down, looking at some indicator in the economy, would be a much more lean and effective way to go. Many economists will. The other point really is not just about caps. 70% of the green cards are awarded on family reunification basis. So the shift from a focus on this family reunification to a focus on labor needs, I think, is another thing that, if anything, will even improve this positive impact. And there are some. Of course, there are. I think it's wrong to divide the nuclear family. You want the minor children and the spouse to be, but there are some kind of arcane provision while adult siblings are preferred, or overage, or kids who are of age are preferred to other. I don't see why we should prefer a sibling of a person who's here vis-a-vis a person who's demanded in a type of skill and occupation which is demanded in the United States. So again, it would be just because many of these things. So I come from reading this book by Pia Orenius at the Dallas Fed, who has a long book on how potentially one would reform the immigration system to make it a little bit more labor market friendly. And I agree with a lot of things that she says there. So if you're curious to think how economists think a little bit about that, I think that's a good reference.
So finally, Giovanni and I disagree about something. This is fun. I actually agree. I mean, Pia's book is great. You should all read it. I agree about the family visas, actually. But about the commission, I strongly disagree. So, it sounds good. Responsive, more responsive. Congress has this low, flat line and it doesn't change, and that's terrible. And obviously Congress, it's too politicized, and that's terrible. So it sounds good. Let's get some experts who can be more flexible and who can think it through, and it'll be like Giovanni, will be on the commission and he'll be deciding, and it'll be great. But the problem is, what's a commission really going to be in reality, right? I mean, let's look at some of the commissions around town on other things. It's usually a way for Congress to avoid making any decisions, or it's highly politicized. And sometimes it's politicized in obvious ways, and sometimes it's politicized in not so obvious ways, but you have human beings making decisions that the market should be making. Really hard for them to do it in real time. Again, we don't have good data. Now, great for them to collect more data. It would be, it would be really interesting if we could get to a situation where the BLS did know how many carpenters are unemployed in Minnesota right now as opposed to 2 years ago. But that would cost massive amounts of money. And even so, I mean, again, to me, this is what the market has proved. It's why they invented money. It's why markets work. It's because markets are better at allocating scarce resources than human beings making decisions. And so if you had a commission of Pia and Giovanni and whoever else overseeing some basically market mechanism, whether it's an auction or a fee or something else, may be interesting. Or a commission that was doing research, a research institute, of course. I mean, who could object to a research institute? But some people who are not politically accountable in a back room making decisions on the basis of no data that where they're, again, not accountable to the public in any way. I mean, a recipe for much worse. At least we can unelect, we can defeat congressmen. These people we wouldn't even really be able to defeat. So, to me, it really is, it comes back to that's what brought down the Soviet Union. I mean, there was a reason that there wasn't bread in the stores in the Soviet Union was because committees can't make decisions like that. So, sorry, I'm a little passionate about it, but research institute, fine, market mechanism with some experts attending to it, maybe if we could come up with an agreement on the right market mechanism. But a bunch of guys off in the back room, unaccountable, making the decision on the basis of no data, no thank you.
All right, let's take both your question, sir, and Marshall's question, and we'll answer both of them together just in the interest of time, okay?
Thank you. My name is Amador Bustos from Bustos Media in Sacramento. Historically, immigrants have had an uphill battle in terms of attitude and integration. Would economists at one point be able to do like they do a volatility index for stocks, do a fear index for immigrants? Because immigration, particularly the issue now, has suffered from two very unfortunate historical circumstances. As we were very close to doing something in 9/11 and 2001, then 9/11 happened, and so that completely deflated the prospects of doing any comprehensive immigration reform. As it began to pick up again, now we have these unfortunate circumstances in the relationship with Mexico and the U.S. with the drug cartels and all of the attitude that creates fear. So the whole issue is, and the media exploiting that fear index. So would something like that be viable in terms of, and what would be, how do you see combating this issue in the policy side? So to allay the fears that it is, that it's external to the whole problem.
Marshall? Why do you give the microphone to Marshall?
I was going to make a couple of observations and then a question. Observation. The Economist ran a piece 3 years ago. Two pregnant women on the cover. A tale of two, bellies. That was the title. And it said that America's luck is that it is drawing in immigrants. And America's average age 20 years out will be 34, 35, 36. And I'm sorry, Giovanni, but Italy's average age is going to be 54.
You're already 40, yeah.
I hope you're married. You are, yes.
Yeah,
and that Germany's average age will even be higher. And I just point that up because Paul commissioned a Social Security study by our staff and Stuart Anderson, who many of you know. And Stuart found out through Social Security data got to him by one of the senators that if we restricted immigration significantly, the trust fund for Social Security would end a lot sooner than now projected. So there's going to be, we only talk about the costs, but the benefits of a younger age group immigrants who pay into the Social Security fund is the trust fund. and the trust fund could survive a lot longer with a continuation of, immigrants. The second, I think you underplayed the media's importance. It's changed the media. People are no longer reading newspapers and thinking. They're watching Lou Dobbs, and they're watching Bill O'Reilly, and they're watching them frequently, and then it has a, viral effect. Because the nights after Lou Dobbs has these grainy pictures about immigrants coming over the Mexican border, the polls do polls, and they are sensitive to this, and the constant beating. Now, happily, Lou Dobbs is going to run as a Tea Party candidate for hopefully Alice in Wonderland. But in effect, the media has played a very important role, and cable television has meant a change from reading your morning newspaper, and I think that is going to play an increasing role in how we view immigration. Two questions. Why not a Greenspan holier-than-thou commission? I don't mean operational. I don't mean something that you would fear, Tamar. But a Greenspan commission that had Republicans, Democrats on it, but there was the big value of the Social Security Greenspan effort was that you didn't criticize it. Alan Greenspan was running a high. He isn't anymore, but there is a Greenspan out there. And put him to work 3 to 4 years, 2 years, to do a major effort that ends up in a legislative program or an administrative policy program that would respond to a market-based but regulatory framework, fair immigration bill, because it isn't going to happen this year. So we have some time to do it right and give the rationality pill with the real pill and the realistic pill. So I throw that out because I was impressed with what Greenspan did for Social Security. And whether you could do it for immigration or not, I don't know. The last comment, why couldn't you do, Tamar or Giovanni, a trigger mechanism based on an assumption as to demand and based on the fluctuations in the labor market in terms of unemployment, so that when unemployment went down, more immigrants could come in. When unemployment went up, less immigrants could come in, and then you sectorize it within that construct of doing a regulatory framework that is transparent based on individual sector demand. I mean, to me, and one last point: I think academics have done a lousy job. Now, I don't mean the two of you, but there are articles every day or every month in the paper suggesting Borges says this, and the headlines read more vulgar than his analysis. His analysis actually minor impacts. And then Giovanni Peri says this, and yours tends to be overblown, that says, you say nothing's going to go wrong. And both of you are talking about the future, and in the future, everybody who's affected in minority areas is going to be dead. I mean, so they draw their analysis from anecdotes because you have the competing. Why don't Borges and you and Tamar and a few of the other top people, Frank Bean at UCI and the guy at San Diego, get in a room, throw out the key, find a database that works for you all and a methodology, if it isn't the local labor markets but the national market, find a database and a methodology that works for them all and help the public understand what is, happening instead of competing each for your own grants. We'll find a way to get you a major grant, take up the rest of your life. But come up with something that we don't get competing analysis. Every time you do one, he does one. And, I choose you, but others choose him.
Why don't you go for it?
Yeah, his last part is going to swallow everything, so let's wait a second. Let me go in order. The fear index. Yeah, so I like measuring things. I do. I think we, many cases, we need better better data in order to understand the picture. So I think there are some groups. So I think the Pew Hispanic Index, Pew Hispanic Center does some polls regularly on what are the attitudes towards immigration, globalization, trade. A lot of the issue we have been talking about immigration sometimes also recur about the fear of China in terms of trade. So people do that, and I think people now start monitoring how they move and try to understand what drives them. Bridging what Marshall was saying, yeah, I think the media do move this. For an economist, is that believes sort of in choice under alternative and following incentives. Ultimately, the opinion of people is driven by the media, but also by a set of sort of consideration, individual thing so the media is a manifestation of this. I don't know if it really trumps and swings rather than amplify some of these fears and fluctuations of opinion. As far as that, yes, I think it's nice to develop better index, better measure, and understand how the policy responds to that. The demographics of immigration are very important. So they are very important in the U.S. and in Europe, but also on the other side. So if you look at the demographics of Latin America, it's pretty clear that Mexico, he is also the new generation of Mexicans are much, much smaller, and the new generation of Chinese are incredibly smaller than they were 20 years ago. So on one hand, yes, the U.S. is growing a little bit thanks to migrants, but there won't be from this country of immigration a large number of young generation in the next 10, 20 years. So 10, 20 years from now, we can be sitting here and trying to identify which one with the next big country of immigration that is not Mexico and is not Latin America is unlikely to be Asia, in fact, because Asia had a demographic transition which is abysmal. In Europe, Eastern Europe for a while had migration. Eastern Europe, young generation is being obliterated. The fertility rate is 1 there, so well below replacement. So maybe the global demography is going to affect. Maybe Africa, if it starts developing, is going to become the next place where immigrants come from. So the dynamic thinking about this, of how this is going to play out for the U.S., has to take into account what is going on also in other countries. Now, for the tough question of the scientific debate so far has evolved that a lot of people, so there is not just me, Borjas, and Card doing work on this. There are a lot of young people, there are a lot of things. So the way in which I read the literature, putting together the work that Ethan Lewis at Dartmouth is doing, that Adriana Kugler at Houston is doing, that Gordon Anson at San Diego is doing, I think George Borjas has a very big weight. He has been a leader, and if you read all his paper up to 2000, I think I agree with you. Maybe we should come out with a clear, more unified voice. But the economists have always said, on average, the effect on employment is small. There is a little distributional effect, maybe, and maybe the low skill lose 1-2%, the high skill gain to 1-2%, and I say no, it's 0-1%, it's 2-3%. But maybe for the big debate, what needs to come across is that when you measure these things, the effects are quite small there, and we can quantify this better in the short run, in the long run. So I don't know. So I agree with you that maybe these internal quibbles on detail of the estimation and of the number hurts the message that gets transmitted outside. So people say, well, look, even the economists disagree. So in the end, everybody's opinion is as good as theirs. And so there was this there was this very good book now in 1997 which was written. There was a commission which was created, so I'm talking about the scientific part, with all these big names from immigration, which came out with a book in 1997, very outdated now, but which for a while was the consensus. And the consensus, again, the way I read the book is that no devastating effect of the labor market, small positive surplus for the average American, maybe a little redistributive effect, and even even on the fiscal side, there was what you say. I mean, if you just consider the impact right now, maybe it's negative. But if you project the fact that immigrants are young and they're going to pay taxes, the long run impact is not large. So what I'm saying is that I take your proposal. Maybe it's something I should chew on and I think on, because I do think that maybe coming together scholars who do study on this and coming up with a agreed upon set of facts and method is a good thing. I still think that the problem comes then when our results are made captive by, and I know Borjas, I know Card, we are sometimes, people don't care about and in policy, people don't look if you publish on the American Economic Journal or you publish in the bulletin of your county, right? So in the end, sometimes there are some studies which are very, very questionable in terms of method that I see on the media get almost the same trumpeting. So I don't know if it's an issue of we did a lousy job, we did for sure, but there is also this incredible animosity and ideology involved that just grabs some results and pull them one way or the other. And I don't know if there is something that we can do to improve this, but this has been an issue which has bothered me.
So I'm going to just be very short. Yeah. Answer a couple one technical point and get to politics. The idea of a trigger that goes with unemployment is a really nice one, except that, unemployment in Detroit, I think we're up to, 15, 20%. It doesn't affect the need, again, for the people to do the hotel work just a few counties away in the hotels on the shore of Lake Michigan. So, and it certainly doesn't, the unemployment in Detroit doesn't tell you about whether you need workers in Los Angeles, and the unemployment in carpenters doesn't tell you about whether you need engineers. So it's a very nice idea. Let's make it simple. Let's just have the numbers go up and down with the unemployment rate. But that, that's a very, very, very crude instrument. And so maybe you could have the unemployment rate give you some guidance, but I think it would be really scary to just peg it to the unemployment rate. The Greenspan Commission on Social Security, well, I think you answered your own question. We had a great Greenspan Commission on Social Security, but we haven't changed the system yet. We haven't fixed the law. So, my concern is that a commission is just another way to punt it down the road. It'd be great to have some expert advice. There have been a lot of commissions on immigration. Great, let's have another one. But ultimately, Congress has to do the hard job of getting in there and taking the commission's advice or the knowledge we have and crafting a bill. And the truth is, we know what the outlines of a bill are like. I mean, this is like peace in the Middle East. People know what the answer is. It's those 4 pillars I talked about. We can argue a little bit about how exactly the details of those pillars, but pretty much the answer, that's the solution, people know. The question is, how do we get there politically? And can we do all 4 at once, or how do we put them together? So a commission that sort of reinvented that knowledge or gave an imprimatur to that knowledge, great. But for me, it's basically another delaying device for the hard work. That's that legislative back and forth and really coming up with a deal. Now, the good news, and this is where I'll close about that political back and forth. In my view, yes, we've had 9/11. Yes, we now have the Mexican drug violence, but it's not really true that the public's attitudes get dramatically worse with those things. The public attitudes, what we've traced with the public attitudes more and more follow this basic realism of there's 11 million people here, we can't send them home. What are we going to do about them? And, and yes, there's some 15, 20% of the public that doesn't get that and isn't with that, but most of the public gets that. Now, they don't necessarily get the fine points of, or what I think is the important point of that we need the visas. And, do they care about employment-based visas or family visas or like that? No. But again, growing realism that we have to solve this and that solving it means realism, I think that's an increasing public awareness that we shouldn't scoff at. And the other good news is that I think if members of Congress basically understand it too. If they could take the votes on this in a desert island with no cameras, we would pass reform overwhelmingly in both houses. People understand the problem, understand what needs to be done. The problem is that they're worried about those 15 to 20% of voters that they think don't get it. And, in an election, 15 to 20% of voters can do a lot of damage. But, what, in my view, has stopped us recently, it's not so much disagreement about immigration, because we haven't had really a big debate about immigration in the last couple of years. What's stopped us in the last couple of years, it's the Democrats and Republicans haven't really cooperated to solve anything, right? We've had Democrats making proposals that Republicans, that are too far to the left of what Republicans can do, and so Republicans say no. So I sort of blame both sides for a kind of polarized situation where they're not rolling up their sleeves and coming to compromises. And that's more than difference of public opinion on immigration. I mean, yes, there's difference on public opinion on immigration, but it's that we haven't been in the legislative environment where they've really been solving some of the harder problems. And so, what I'm looking for is in 2011, are they going to come back in a mood to solve some problems and make some compromises? And I think in that kind of climate, despite, yes, there is public division over immigration, but, if they were in a mood to tackle some tough things and solve them together, I'm hopeful that we could come up and they could get to a solution.
Well, that's a good note to end on. So I want to thank all of you in the audience for being so attentive and for your very good questions. I want to thank the Merage Foundation again for making it possible. Discussions of this kind are really wonderful and I think quite useful. But most of all, I would ask you to join me in thanking our panelists.